Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The alarm buzzed with its usual insistence, pulling me from the hazy, half-remembered remnants of a dream. I blinked, trying to shake off the morning fog, and reached over to turn it off. As I settled back down, I felt Claire shifting beside me, her arm draping over my chest. It was a familiar feeling, but today, something about it felt wrong, almost hollow. As we both got ready for work, she moved with the same practiced routine she always did. But this morning, every gesture seemed deliberate, calculated even. She was watching me closely, as though checking to see if I noticed anything. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was nothing, but the feeling gnawed at me like a loose thread in an old sweater, something small, but impossible to ignore. Over breakfast, Claire told me she'd be out late tonight. "It's a work thing," she explained. "A few people from the team are going out, and I might not be back until tomorrow morning. Don't wait up, okay?" I nodded, feigning indifference, though the pit in my stomach tightened. She'd been going out with this team a lot lately. I'd heard enough stories about her new colleague, some guy named Evan who seemed to be the star of every office tale she shared. But I told myself not to jump to conclusions. We'd been together for over a decade. We'd weathered so much together, stressful jobs, family pressures, even that rough patch a few years back. Claire had always been my rock, and I'd always trusted her. But lately, my trust felt like a weight pressing down on me, something I couldn't simply ignore anymore. The day at work dragged, each hour stretching like taffy, my mind circling the same doubts and worries. By the time I got home, the house felt empty and silent, a void that only amplified the ache I couldn't shake. Claire was already gone, her usual spot at the table glaringly vacant. I made myself dinner, a sad excuse for a meal, and sat down, going through the motions as I tried to drown my doubts with a mindless TV show. But her empty chair loomed, and I found myself turning off the television, the quiet around me more comforting than the noise. Finally, after staring at the darkened screen, I decided to investigate. I knew it was a dangerous road to go down, the kind that could confirm things I might not want to know. But I couldn't help myself. I pulled out my laptop, opened the phone bill account, and scanned through the recent calls. Most numbers were ones I recognized, our families, a few friends, work contacts. But one stood out, a number with an unfamiliar area code that had been popping up more frequently. I grabbed my phone and ran a search, but it turned up nothing definitive. I told myself it was nothing, a client, a friend. But that didn't explain the pit in my stomach or the way her casual work event felt like a thinly veiled lie. Determined to push it out of my mind, I decided I'd confront her tomorrow, give her the chance to explain. But as I sat in our living room, staring at the empty chair across from me, the feeling that I was ignoring something crucial refused to go away. It felt like there was an invisible wall between us, one I hadn't noticed until recently. And now, once seen, it couldn't be unseen. The next morning, I woke to find Claire's side of the bed still empty, the sheets untouched. She must have stayed out, just as she'd said. I went about my morning in a daze, pouring coffee and moving through my routine with a numbness that clung to every step. By the time I saw her again, she breezed through the door as if she'd just stepped out for a moment. She kissed me lightly on the cheek, her face flushed, as though she'd had a fantastic night. I watched her for a moment, trying to catch a glimpse of something beneath her smile, but her face gave nothing away. She moved into the kitchen, humming softly, acting as though nothing was amiss. And maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was all in my head. But I couldn't let it go. I went through the day feeling like a shadow, unable to focus, my thoughts circling around the same question. Was she lying to me? That night, as she went to bed early, claiming exhaustion from the previous evening, I decided I couldn't keep pretending. I sat up late, alone in the dark, until I finally reached for her phone. I knew it was a breach of trust, but something in me screamed that I had to know the truth. When I unlocked it, I found her messages empty, her call history spotless. If there was anything incriminating, it was gone. But my suspicion only grew. She'd never bothered with such thorough digital housekeeping before, and it felt like a performance, carefully scripted and planned, each detail accounted for. As I scrolled through her messages, the pit in my stomach turned into a chasm. I returned her phone, slipping it back onto the nightstand, and sat in the darkness, the room so silent that even my own breathing felt deafening. Every little thing she'd done over the last few months replayed in my mind, every late night, every secret smile, every text that pulled her attention at odd hours. I had hoped I'd find something to dispel my suspicions, a simple explanation that would pull me back from this cliff. But there was nothing but shadows, each one deepening the sense that something was horribly wrong. The next morning, Claire was up before me, smiling as she prepared breakfast, looking every bit the woman I had married. She poured me coffee, her face warm and inviting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living with a stranger. I felt the urge to confront her rise and then fade, my own uncertainty holding me back. As the day wore on, my frustration turned to resolve. I realized that I didn't need to wait for her to slip up or catch her in some elaborate scheme. I didn't need evidence or confirmation from a message or call. I had all the proof I needed in the hollowness that had settled between us, a chasm I couldn't ignore. The decision to confront her, to finally bring everything out into the open, was like a heavy stone pressing on my chest, but it brought with it a strange kind of calm. I had spent weeks in a silent torment, caught between doubt and denial. Now, it felt like the only path left. The morning sunlight cast long shadows across the kitchen as I made coffee, mentally preparing myself for what was to come. Claire was still asleep, wrapped in a careless sprawl across the bed, and I had a good hour before she'd wake up. I poured the coffee slowly, letting its warmth seep into my hands, grounding me. I knew that once I asked, everything would change. But then, as if sensing something amiss, Claire appeared in the doorway. She was wrapped in a faded robe, hair tousled, looking every bit like the woman I'd spent my life with. There was something achingly familiar about the way she shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes, and for a moment, I almost backed down. "Morning," she mumbled, reaching for the coffee pot. Her eyes met mine, and something in her expression faltered. She smiled, a little too bright. "What's with the serious face?" I held her gaze, steady and unwavering. "We need to talk, Claire." She froze, mug halfway to her lips. "About what?" I gestured to the table. "Sit with me." Reluctantly, she lowered herself into the chair opposite me, her smile fading. Her eyes darted around the room, anywhere but at me. The silence between us stretched, heavy and loaded with things unsaid. Finally, I spoke. "Who's Evan?" She blinked, the question catching her off guard. She swallowed, setting her mug down carefully. "Evan." Her voice was too calm, as if she had rehearsed this. "Yes, Evan. The colleague you mentioned from work. The one you've been spending so much time with." Claire laughed, a forced, brittle sound. "Oh, come on. Are you really jealous of Evan? He's just a friend from work." "Just a friend?" I repeated, my tone sharper than I intended. "Claire, you've been staying out late, spending more nights away, saying it's work, that you're with friends. And every time you're gone, it's him you're with, isn't it?" Her expression shifted, a mixture of surprise and indignation. "You're being paranoid. I told you, it's work. Sometimes we hang out after because everyone's there. It's not like I'm sneaking around." She trailed off, her eyes dropping to her mug. "Are you sure about that?" I leaned forward, studying her face, watching as her confident exterior began to crack. She hesitated, glancing away, and that was all the answer I needed. The pit in my stomach solidified into something cold and unyielding. I hadn't expected her to admit anything outright, but her silence was damning. "Look," she said finally, her voice tight. "If you don't trust me, that's on you. I've told you nothing's going on. Maybe you're reading too much into things. Maybe, I agreed, though my tone suggested otherwise. But then, if there's nothing going on, why delete your call history? Why erase all your messages? Her face paled, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She looked down, her fingers twisting around the handle of her mug. You don't need to lie, Claire. Just, tell me the truth. Is there something going on between you and him? For a moment, I thought she might come clean, might finally tell me everything. But she pressed her lips together, a defiant look settling on her face. I don't have to explain myself to you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words cut deeper than I'd expected. I leaned back, my jaw clenched, the calm resolve I'd held on to slipping through my fingers. So that's it? I asked. After all these years, that's all you have to say? Claire looked away, her expression unreadable, and I knew then that there would be no confession, no apology. Whatever was between us was beyond repair. I pushed back from the table and stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I felt a strange sense of finality, as though a door had closed between us, and there was no way back. I'm done, I said, my voice steady. I'm not going to keep doing this. If you want him, go to him. But don't expect me to just sit here, waiting. Claire's face twisted in anger, and she rose to her feet, her voice rising. Oh, so now you're giving me an ultimatum? Is that what this is? I stared at her, stunned by her reaction. I had been expecting guilt, maybe even regret, but her anger took me by surprise. It was as if she had already accepted this, had been prepared for this moment, and any hint of remorse had long since faded. You know what? She continued, her voice shaking. I deserve better than this constant suspicion, this paranoia. Maybe I am happier when I'm with other people, because you've become a miserable, distrustful person. Her words were like a slap, each one stinging more than the last. I wanted to shout, to tell her that she was the reason for this, that her lies and secrecy had driven me to this point. But I couldn't find the words. Instead, I watched her storm out of the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall, each step a reminder that whatever we had built together was crumbling, piece by piece. When I heard the front door slam, I sank back into the chair, numb and exhausted. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty coffee cup in front of me, the bitter taste of our argument lingering in my mind. The house was silent, the kind of silence that clings to the walls after a storm, and I felt as if I was trapped in that silence, unable to move or breathe. It was then that I knew I couldn't stay. Not in this house, not in this marriage. The weight of her betrayal was too heavy, pressing down on me until it felt like I was drowning. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the air felt thick, suffocating. I rose slowly, my mind made up, and went to our bedroom. I packed a bag, grabbing only what I needed, barely thinking as I moved through the room. It was strange, filling the suitcase with clothes and toiletries, items that once had felt essential to me but now felt hollow, like remnants of a life that no longer belonged to me. With the bag in hand, I took one last look around the room, the bed unmade, Claire's things scattered across the dresser. The sight stirred something in me, a mix of anger and sadness, but I pushed it down, knowing that I couldn't let it hold me back. As I walked out of the house, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I didn't know where I was going, or what lay ahead, but I knew that I couldn't stay here, bound by memories and broken promises. I stepped out into the early morning light, the world stretching out before me, unknown and uncertain, but somehow, for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Leaving the house felt like escaping from a prison I hadn't known I was in. Each step down the driveway seemed to release a new weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I loaded my bag into the car, took a deep breath, and pulled out, unsure of where I was headed. I drove aimlessly, my mind racing through the last few hours, replaying every moment, every word Claire and I had thrown at each other. Eventually, I found myself parked by the lake on the edge of town. The sun had risen fully now, casting a calm, golden glow over the water. It was quiet here, peaceful. The contrast to my turmoil was almost laughable. I sat for a while, letting the silence sink in, filling the empty spaces left by our shattered marriage. Pulling out my phone, I scrolled through the contacts, instinctively searching for someone to talk to. I stopped on Ethan's name. He'd been my best friend since college, the guy who knew me inside out. We'd been through everything together, breakups, career changes, my wedding to Claire, even the rough patches in our marriage. If there was anyone who'd understand, it was him. I hit call and listened as the phone rang. After a few rings, he picked up, his voice cheerful and unguarded. "Hey, man. What's up?" "Hey, Ethan," I replied, my voice sounding rough even to my own ears. I tried to steady myself, but I could feel the weight of everything crashing down again. "Can we meet up?" The change in his tone was instant. "Of course. Where are you?" "By the lake, near that old fishing spot we used to go to." "Give me 20 minutes, he said, and I heard the rustle of him moving around, likely grabbing his keys. When he arrived, he found me sitting on a weathered bench overlooking the lake, lost in thought. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down next to me, respecting the silence. After a while, he turned to me, his face a mixture of concern and empathy. "So," he said gently, "what's going on?" I took a shaky breath, struggling to find the right words. "It's Claire. I found out she's been seeing someone else." His face fell, and for a moment, he looked almost as devastated as I felt. "Oh, man. I'm so sorry." I nodded, unable to look him in the eye. "It's been going on for a while, I think." She tried to deny it, but there's no other explanation. The late nights, the deleted texts, the distance. I confronted her about it, but she wouldn't admit anything. She just got angry and turned it back on me. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I never would have thought. I mean, I always thought you two were solid. I didn't know things had gotten so bad." "Neither did I admitted. At least, not until recently. I don't even know if I missed the signs or just didn't want to see them." For a while, we just sat there, staring out at the water, the weight of everything pressing down on us. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "So, what's next?" The question hit me hard. I hadn't thought that far ahead, hadn't allowed myself to. Leaving the house was the first step, but the future beyond that was a gaping void. I shrugged, trying to mask the uncertainty that gnawed at me. "I don't know. I don't even know where to go from here." He nodded, seeming to understand. "Look, why don't you crash at my place for a while? You don't need to figure everything out right now. Just, take some time to process it." The offer was a lifeline, and I grabbed it gratefully. "Thanks, Ethan. I appreciate it." Ethan clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Anytime, man. You do the same for me." With that, we left the lake and drove to Ethan's apartment, where he set me up in his guest room. Over the next few days, I tried to adjust to the new reality. I threw myself into work, desperate for a distraction, but every moment outside the office felt like an open wound. My life, my marriage, the future I had once taken for granted, it had all been turned upside down. One evening, as I sat alone in the guest room, I found myself scrolling through my photo gallery. Images of Claire and me, from our early days together to the recent trips we'd taken, filled the screen. I stared at a photo from our anniversary trip 2 years ago, where we were smiling, arms around each other, the ocean stretching out behind us. It was the kind of picture that painted a perfect story, but now, looking at it, I saw nothing but lies. I closed the app, feeling the anger rise in me, sharper than it had been before. Ethan had been kind, letting me stay, offering support, but this anger, this was something I needed to face alone. I needed to confront Claire, to demand answers, to get closure on the years we'd spent together. The next day, I called her. My heart pounded as the phone rang, each beep feeling like an eternity. She picked up on the third ring, her voice cautious. "Hello. It's me," I said, my voice steady. "We need to talk." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her tension. I don't think that's a good idea, Mark." "Too bad," I replied, refusing to back down. "I deserve some answers, Claire. After everything we've been through, you owe me that much." She didn't respond right away, and I wondered if she would hang up. But finally, she sighed. "Fine. Let's meet tomorrow at the cafe near the old bookstore." When we met, the cafe was nearly empty, a quiet haven amidst the chaos that had become my life. Claire arrived a few minutes after me, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. She slid into the seat across from me, her fingers twisting nervously around a napkin. "So," she said, barely meeting my gaze. "What do you want to know?" I leaned forward, my voice low. "I want to know why, Claire. I want to know why you did this." She looked away, staring down at her hands. "I don't know," she whispered. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen. It just did." "Just did?" I repeated, my voice tinged with bitterness. "You don't accidentally end up in someone else's bed, Claire." She flinched, but she didn't deny it. "It wasn't like that," she said softly. I felt so trapped, Mark. I felt like we were stuck, like I couldn't breathe. And then he came along, and suddenly, I felt alive again." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "So, what, I wasn't enough for you?" "That's not it," she insisted, finally looking up at me. Her eyes were filled with a strange mixture of sadness and anger. "It was never about you. It was about me. I needed to feel something, to escape. I know it's selfish, and I know I hurt you, but I couldn't keep pretending." We sat there in silence, the weight of her words settling between us. I could feel the anger boiling beneath the surface, but I forced myself to stay calm. "So, where does that leave us?" She hesitated, then looked down, as if unable to meet my gaze. "I don't know, Mark. I don't know if there's anything left to save." The finality in her voice felt like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I had come here hoping for some kind of resolution, a way to salvage something from the wreckage. But now, hearing her, I knew that was impossible. She had already let go of us a long time ago. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. "I guess that's it, then," I said, my voice hollow. I turned and walked out of the cafe, not looking back. As I stepped onto the street, I felt an unexpected surge of relief. It was over. The life I had built, the future I had planned, it was all gone. But in its place, there was a strange, painful freedom, an empty space where I could finally start to rebuild. The days after that final meeting with Claire passed in a haze. I returned to Ethan's apartment and threw myself into work, trying to distract myself from the void she'd left. In my clearer moments, I could feel a faint glimmer of freedom, a sense of relief that it was over, that I didn't have to live under the cloud of doubt any longer. But even then, something didn't sit right. It felt unfinished, like I'd left a door cracked open, a piece of the puzzle missing. One evening, Ethan came home to find me sitting on the couch, deep in thought. He plopped down beside me, tossing his keys on the coffee table with a loud clatter. "You doing all right?" he asked, leaning back and eyeing me with a concerned expression. I nodded, but I could feel the weight of my own uncertainty pressing down. "I think so," I said, but it sounded weak, even to my ears. "There's just something that's been bugging me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, unsure of how to put it into words. "It's like, even after everything, I feel like I don't have the whole story. I feel like there's something Claire didn't tell me. He shifted, glancing away, his posture suddenly tense. Maybe it's best not to dig too deep, Mark. Sometimes you just have to let things lie. The comment struck me as odd, but I brushed it off. I don't know, man. I keep going back over everything. Claire, she wasn't just a fling type of person. Sure, we had our problems, but she was never the kind to throw everything away for something so fleeting. Ethan didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, and he picked at a non-existent thread on the couch. I turned to look at him, a strange feeling of dread curling in my gut. You knew, didn't you? Ethan froze, his face a mask of guilt and regret. I could see the truth in his eyes, and suddenly, everything clicked into place, the awkward silences, his insistence that I move on, his constant support and availability. It was too perfect, too coincidental. Mark, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't want it to happen. It just did. The room seemed to spin as the realization crashed over me. It wasn't Evan. It was Ethan, my best friend, the one person I had trusted with everything. I struggled to process his words, my mind refusing to accept the betrayal. How long? My voice was low, barely controlled. Ethan looked down, shame flooding his features. It started a few months ago. She was feeling lost, and we were both there for each other. I never meant for it to happen, Mark. I swear. The anger surged, hot and fierce, pushing away the hurt that had hollowed me out. You were supposed to be my friend, I spat. You were the one person I trusted. And you did this? He looked up, his face twisted with regret. I know. I know I messed up, Mark. I've hated myself every day for it. I tried to be there for you, to make up for it. But I know it doesn't change anything. I don't expect you to forgive me. I clenched my fists, my whole body tense with the weight of his betrayal. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was afraid of losing you, he said, his voice choked. I was selfish. I thought maybe, somehow, I could fix this, that you'd never have to know. I stood up, unable to stay in the same room as him for another second. I grabbed my bag, my mind racing. The relief I had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a raw, pulsing ache. Everything I thought I knew had been turned upside down, the foundations of my life shattered. Mark, wait, Ethan said, reaching out, his voice desperate. Please, don't leave like this. I'm so sorry. I turned to face him, my expression cold. Sorry doesn't fix this, Ethan. You took everything from me. My marriage, my trust, everything. Without another word, I walked out the door, slamming it behind me. The night air was cold, biting against my skin, but I barely felt it. I wandered aimlessly through the streets, my mind spinning, trying to come to terms with what I had just learned. Eventually, I found myself back at the lake, the same place where I had first confided in Ethan, where I had poured out my suspicions and pain. I sank onto the bench, staring out at the dark water, the weight of betrayal settling deep in my bones. For hours, I sat there, replaying every memory, every moment that now felt like a lie. The sunrise began to creep over the horizon, casting a dim light across the lake, but it did nothing to ease the darkness that had settled over me. Just as the first light touched the water, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, and to my surprise, Claire was there, looking as lost and broken as I felt. She hesitated, then sat beside me on the bench, staring out at the lake in silence. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and raw. I didn't want you to find out like this. I looked at her, my anger tempered by the exhaustion that had taken over. Then why did you do it? Why him? She sighed, her shoulders slumping. I don't know. I was lost, and he was there, telling me everything I wanted to hear. But it was a mistake, Mark. The worst mistake of my life. The sincerity in her voice caught me off guard. I had expected excuses, deflections, but all I saw was regret. Still, I couldn't ignore the damage that had been done. "It doesn't change anything," I said, my voice hollow. She nodded, wiping away a tear. "I know. I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix it, but I am." We sat in silence for a long time, both of us staring at the water, lost in our own thoughts. I could feel the last remnants of my old life slipping away, leaving behind a strange, painful emptiness. After a while, Claire stood up, looking down at me one last time. "Goodbye, Mark." I watched her walk away, feeling the finality of it settle in my chest. For the first time since it all began, I felt a glimmer of peace. The anger, the hurt, it was still there, but beneath it was something else, acceptance. As the sun rose higher, casting a warm glow over the lake, I took a deep breath, letting it fill the empty spaces inside me. This was the end, but it was also a beginning. And for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it.